Long before Minamoto no Yoshitsune ever commanded troops in the field, he was immersed in the study of warfare. Born into the violent politics of late Heian Japan, Yoshitsune lost his father at a young age and was removed from the world of court intrigue and battle. Sent to Kurama Temple, he was expected to live a quiet religious life, far from the conflicts tearing the country apart. Yet the monastery, intended to separate him from war, instead became the place where his military education truly began. Life in a temple offered something rare for a future commander: time. While other young nobles trained in archery, horsemanship, and swordsmanship, Yoshitsune had access to texts, oral teachings, and the accumulated knowledge of earlier generations. Buddhist temples in Japan were not only religious centers, but also repositories of books and foreign learning, including Chinese classics that had shaped East Asian military thought for centuries. Through these works, Yoshitsune encountered ideas about strategy, deception, logistics, and leadership long before he faced real combat. This early exposure allowed him to understand war not as a series of heroic duels, but as a system governed by patterns. Battles were shaped by terrain, timing, morale, and the psychology of commanders as much as by individual skill. By studying past campaigns, Yoshitsune learned how armies moved, how leaders reacted under pressure, and how small decisions could determine the outcome of entire wars. These lessons were absorbed in an environment free from immediate danger, allowing reflection rather than instinct to guide his thinking. Equally important was the habit of analysis he developed. Reading about previous conflicts forced Yoshitsune to ask why certain actions succeeded while others failed. Victories were not simply celebrated, they were dissected. Defeats were not dismissed as fate, but examined for their causes. This approach trained him to think several steps ahead, anticipating enemy responses rather than merely reacting to them. Such mental preparation would later allow him to act decisively in moments when hesitation could mean disaster. Studying warfare before fighting also gave Yoshitsune emotional distance from violence. War, to him, was not a sudden shock but a familiar subject. When he finally entered battle, the chaos of combat did not overwhelm him, because he had already encountered its logic through study. This calm understanding set him apart from commanders who relied purely on courage or tradition. He had already fought countless battles in his mind, rehearsing possibilities and outcomes. By the time Yoshitsune emerged from the monastery and joined the Minamoto cause, he possessed something rare among medieval warriors: a strategic foundation built before experience, not after it. His later successes were not the result of spontaneous brilliance, but of years spent absorbing, comparing, and internalizing the lessons of earlier wars. In this sense, Yoshitsune's greatest training did not occur on the battlefield, but in quiet study, where he learned how wars are won long before a single sword is drawn. The warfare Yoshitsune encountered in late Heian Japan was shaped by long, established samurai traditions. Battles often followed predictable patterns, with commanders expecting formal engagements, announced advances, and honor-bound conduct that emphasized individual bravery as much as coordinated maneuver. These conventions had value in maintaining discipline and identity, but they also created rigid expectations. Yoshitsune quickly recognized that such predictability could become a weakness when facing an enemy who understood the rules too well. Rather than fully embracing these traditions, Yoshitsune deliberately stepped outside them. He did not reject samurai culture, but he refused to be limited by it. Where other commanders sought decisive clashes on familiar ground, he focused on movement, timing, and exploiting terrain the enemy considered unusable. This approach often shocked both allies and opponents, as it challenged deeply ingrained assumptions about how battles should be fought. To Yoshitsune, effectiveness mattered more than conformity. One of the clearest ways Yoshitsune broke from tradition was his emphasis on surprise. Conventional samurai warfare favored visibility and reputation. Yoshitsune favored uncertainty. He launched attacks at unexpected times, approached from directions thought impossible, and used speed to deny the enemy time to organize. By doing so, he turned psychological disruption into a weapon. Opposing forces were often defeated not because they were weaker, but because they were confused, reacting to a situation that no longer followed familiar rules. Yoshitsune also redefined the role of leadership in battle. Traditional commanders often led from prominent positions, reinforcing hierarchy and honor. Yoshitsune, by contrast, placed himself where he could best control the flow of combat, even if that meant personal risk or unconventional positioning. He valued coordination over display, ensuring that units moved together rather than acting as isolated bands of warriors, seeking individual glory. This shift transformed his forces into a more cohesive instrument of war. Terrain played a central role in his rejection of standard methods. While many commanders avoided difficult ground, Yoshitsune sought it out. Steep slopes, narrow passes, and unexpected routes became tools rather than obstacles. By mastering these environments, he forced enemies into defensive positions they had not prepared for. This willingness to fight where others would not further separated him from traditional samurai expectations and amplified the element of surprise. Perhaps most importantly, Yoshitsune understood that tradition could not substitute for adaptability. Samurai norms were shaped by past conflicts, but the wars Yoshitsune fought demanded flexibility. He treated tradition as a reference point, not a rulebook. When established methods aligned with his objectives, he used them. When they did not, he abandoned them without hesitation. This pragmatic mindset allowed him to stay unpredictable, ensuring that enemies could not rely on precedent to anticipate his actions. By rejecting rigid adherence to traditional samurai methods, Yoshitsune created a style of warfare that felt unfamiliar and unsettling to his opponents. His victories were not just military successes, but demonstrations that warfare evolves, and that those willing to question inherited practices gain a decisive advantage. Yoshitsune's success on the battlefield was closely tied to his understanding of speed, surprise, and terrain as interconnected elements rather than separate considerations. In an age when armies often moved slowly and deliberately, he treated rapid movement as a strategic weapon. Speed allowed him to dictate the pace of engagements, forcing enemies to react rather than plan. By arriving earlier than expected or striking before opposing commanders could assemble their forces, he disrupted coordination and undermined morale even before fighting began. Surprise amplified the effects of speed. Yoshitsune understood that an unexpected action could have a greater impact than a larger force deployed predictably. Rather than confronting enemies head-on, he sought to appear where he was least expected, often choosing routes that others dismissed as impractical. These sudden maneuvers created confusion within enemy ranks, as commanders struggled to understand how Yoshitsune's forces had reached such positions. The psychological shock of being attacked from an unforeseen direction often caused defensive plans to collapse. Terrain was the foundation that made both speed and surprise possible. While many commanders viewed difficult landscapes as obstacles, Yoshitsune treated them as opportunities. Mountains, rivers, narrow passes, and coastal paths became instruments of strategy. By moving through harsh or dangerous terrain, he avoided detection and bypassed enemy defenses. These routes, though physically demanding, allowed him to approach battlefields from angles that neutralized numerical disadvantages and limited the enemy's ability to maneuver. One of Yoshitsune's most effective practices was using terrain to compress or disorganize opposing forces. Narrow passages restricted enemy formations, preventing them from deploying effectively, while elevated ground offered both visibility and momentum. Descending from higher ground at speed multiplied the force of an attack, turning gravity itself into an ally. Such maneuvers required precise timing and disciplined troops, but when executed correctly, they overwhelmed defenders before they could adapt. Speed also extended beyond movement to decision-making. Yoshitsune acted quickly once an opportunity appeared, understanding that hesitation could erase the advantages gained through surprise. He issued clear, simple orders that could be executed rapidly, ensuring that momentum was maintained throughout an engagement. This decisiveness contrasted with commanders who delayed action while seeking consensus or adhering to ritualized planning. The combined use of speed, surprise, and terrain also allowed Yoshitsune to compensate for limited resources. He did not always command the largest armies, but his ability to move faster and strike unexpectedly often made numerical superiority irrelevant. Enemies found themselves forced into defensive positions on unfavorable ground, their larger forces rendered ineffective by confusion and poor positioning. Perhaps most crucially, these principles kept Yoshitsune unpredictable. Each battle unfolded differently, shaped by the specific landscape and timing he selected. Opponents could not rely on past encounters to anticipate his next move, as he adapted his approach to the environment before him. This adaptability reinforced the psychological pressure on his enemies, who faced not only a skilled commander, but one who turned nature itself into a weapon. Yoshitsune's approach to warfare was grounded in the belief that proven principles mattered more than novelty. Rather than attempting to create entirely new methods of fighting, he focused on understanding the underlying mechanics that governed successful campaigns across different times and cultures. Deception, timing, concentration of force, and decisive movement were not inventions of any one general. They were recurring patterns observed wherever wars were fought. Yoshitsune treated these principles as constants, adaptable to circumstances, but fundamentally reliable. Deception played a central role in his campaigns. Yoshitsune understood that misleading the enemy could achieve results that brute force could not. Feints, sudden changes of direction, and misleading displays of strength were used to distort the opponent's perception of reality. By causing enemies to misjudge his intentions, he forced them into poor decisions. This approach reduced the need for prolonged engagements, allowing victories to be achieved swiftly and with fewer losses. Timing was equally critical. Yoshitsune recognized that even the best maneuver would fail if executed at the wrong moment. He studied when to advance and when to hold back, understanding that patience could be as decisive as aggression. Attacks were launched when the enemy was least prepared, during moments of transition, fatigue, or overconfidence. These carefully chosen moments multiplied the effectiveness of his forces and magnified the impact of surprise. Another principle Yoshitsune relied on was the concentration of force at decisive points. Rather than spreading his troops evenly, he focused strength where it would matter most. By striking critical locations, command centers, weak flanks, or vulnerable lines of retreat, he achieved disproportionate results. This method allowed smaller or less numerous forces to defeat larger armies by targeting their structural weaknesses instead of engaging their full strength. Decisive action was the final element that bound these principles together. Yoshitsune believed that hesitation after gaining an advantage was often more dangerous than initial risk. Once a weakness was exposed, he acted swiftly to exploit it, preventing the enemy from recovering. This decisiveness transformed temporary openings into permanent victories. Battles were not allowed to drift into prolonged stalemates. They were resolved quickly, before uncertainty could erode momentum. What distinguished Yoshitsune was not the originality of these ideas, but the clarity with which he applied them. He did not attempt to adapt principles beyond recognition or pursue innovation for its own sake. Instead, he adjusted established methods to the realities of Japanese terrain, political conditions, and military organization. This balance between tradition and adaptation ensured that his strategies remained both familiar in structure and unpredictable in execution. By grounding his campaigns in proven principles rather than untested ideas, Yoshitsune minimized unnecessary risk. He understood that warfare punished experimentation without understanding. His success demonstrated that mastery lies not in inventing new concepts, but in recognizing which timeless principles apply to the situation at hand and executing them with precision. Yoshitsune's campaigns ended long before his life did, but his strategic vision outlived both victory and exile. In the centuries that followed, his battles became case studies, his name synonymous not with reckless valor, but with intelligent, deliberate warfare. What makes his legacy enduring is not the scale of his conquests, but the structure of his thought, a rare fusion of scholarly reflection and battlefield pragmatism. Unlike many legendary warriors whose fame rests on singular feats, Yoshitsune's impact lies in how he redefined what it meant to prepare for war. He demonstrated that preparation is not merely physical training or stockpiling arms. It is mental discipline, historical inquiry, and the cultivation of judgment. His years at Kurama were not exile, but incubation, a quiet apprenticeship in the logic of conflict. In today's terms, he was a systems thinker before the term existed, attuned to feedback loops between terrain, morale, tempo, and command. This mindset also reveals a deeper truth about leadership. Greatness is not always forged in crisis, but often anticipates it. Yoshitsune did not wait for war to teach him its rules. He learned them in advance, so that when chaos erupted, he remained the calm center. His ability to maintain clarity amid uncertainty, a trait now prized in fields from medicine to crisis management, was rooted in disciplined study, not instinct alone. Moreover, Yoshitsune's story challenges the myth of the natural-born genius. His brilliance was cumulative, layered through texts, questioned through analysis, refined through rehearsal. He failed in politics, but succeeded in war precisely because he treated strategy as a learnable craft, not a mystical gift. This is profoundly relevant today, especially in disciplines like medical imaging or rural health care innovation, where complex systems demand both technical mastery and strategic foresight. In an age of rapid technological change, Yoshitsune's principles are more vital than ever. Speed now means data latency. Surprise translates to asymmetric innovation. Terrain includes digital and logistical landscapes. Whether deploying mobile diagnostic units in remote Punjab or optimizing resource allocation in overstretched clinics, the same core questions persist. Where is the decisive point? When is the right moment? How can limited means achieve maximum effect? Yoshitsune never wrote a treatise, yet his campaigns speak with the clarity of doctrine. His legacy reminds us that true strategy is quiet before it is loud, thoughtful before it is bold. It is the discipline of asking why before charging forward, of studying the past not to repeat it, but to see further. In the end, Minamoto no Yoshitsune did not just win battles. He proved that the most powerful weapon in war, and in life, is the mind, rigorously trained, patiently honed, and always ready.